For many people, narrative strategy isn't really theoretical. It's actually like this daily tug of war between what you believe, what your organization is ready for, and what your donors expect.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started. Welcome, listeners, to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. I'm your host, Russ Phaneuf. Today's episode is a follow-up Q&A to the recent Bridge Conference presentation we did entitled Flipping the Script, a new approach to narrative strategy and storytelling for nonprofits. This was an introduction to narrative strategy, which is a framework that nonprofits can use to create change and impact through storytelling. At the end of our presentation, we promised we'd do this episode and try to answer all of the attendee questions we didn't have time for at the conference, and there were many. If you weren't at the conference, don't worry. I'm going to summarize the key concepts and takeaways for you so all of our Q&A makes sense. We've also included a link to the presentation slides in the show notes, along with some other information. Joining me are my fellow panel members who came out to the Bridge Conference and presented with me and were kind enough to come back and do this Q&A. The first is Sadé Dozan, who is Vice President of Advancement at Borealis Philanthropy. This is Sadé's fourth appearance on NPFX. Welcome back, Sadé, and thank you for being here today.
Woo-woo. Thanks, Russ.
Woo-woo!
And laughing in the background is Josh Gryniewicz. Josh is the founder and chief narrative strategist of Odd Duck LLC. Josh has, of course, been on the podcast before, many times, in fact, and most recently with the first episode of a new interview series he's doing for us on narrative strategy. Josh, thanks for joining us today.
Woo woo!
Wow, lots of woos. Excellent. I'm going to start with a quick summary of what we covered in the Bridge Conference presentation, and I'll get your impressions of the conference very quickly, and then we'll dig into the questions. So why flip the script? At our panel, we talked about the traditional model of nonprofit advancement messaging, where you have either the nonprofit or the donor positioned as the hero. And typically the beneficiary is the victim. And that's what you message around. That's how you fundraise. And the key problem for nonprofits is that it reinforces a power imbalance. What we see is this chance to flip the script, and you have these opportunities to recenter the narrative, to build trust and improve engagement. So at the panel, Josh talked about narrative strategy, and we gave some basics on it. Now, NPFX has created a whole series of episodes about narrative strategy with Josh, and we'll put some links in the show notes to some of those episodes, and we encourage you to check out those episodes. But narrative strategy, just the very basic idea of it is that it's more than just the idea of storytelling. It's really a framework, and it aligns your messaging, your mission, your values, and your approach, and it connects your why, your who, and your how. And then Josh also at the conference talked about typical story versus radical future story, and basically how you change from this idea of typical story of problem and approach and this idea of organizational history and finding solutions and getting eventually to a happily ever after, and really changing that and flipping it to thinking about the world as it could be, and then the world as it is, and how we bridge the gap and what stands in our way, and just this new way of thinking. We talked about principles of ethical storytelling at the conference. And then finally, we ended with panel Q&A. And by the time we got to panel Q&A, we were almost out of time already, which brings us to today and why we're revisiting Q&A and trying to answer even more questions that we received immediately after the conference with people coming up to us on LinkedIn. People asked us questions. We got some questions through email and through the contact page at ipmadvancement.com. And so here we are. But before we get to today's Q&A, I would like to ask, what are your impressions of the Bridge Conference? How did you think it went, and what were your takeaways from it? Sadé, let's start with you.
Yeah, there was a lot of energy there. I love having a room full of people that are kind of studying the same practice, buzzing all around. So I would also say in our session, there were so many things I wish that we could have said. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity. And I think that when we start a conversation is that good, it means we have to continue it.
Yeah, absolutely. Josh, what were your takeaways?
Well, similar. So, I mean, takeaways from the conference, definitely the puppies, hands down. There were puppies there. I could have spent all day with them. But for our panel itself, everything that Sadé just said, like, it was the vibe. I think what impressed me most was just sort of like the range.
Yeah.
We had folks who were, kind of storefront, small, mom, pa, nonprofit, all the way to national and even international NGOs doing solid work around the globe and everything in between.
Yeah.
So I think, one, it was just really interesting to be able to have something that we were putting forward as a panel that was applicable to that broad an audience.
Yeah.
But I do feel like at least the impressions that I got and the folks that sidebarred with us and that came up to us afterwards did have some takeaways regardless of where they were starting from or where their focus is. And then, also just, being able to kind of put forward, the flipping the script and this concept of like hope-centric messaging at a time where most of us and probably many of the people in the room aren't feeling very hopeful.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I just feel like that just underscored the necessity of having these conversations.
Yeah, it seemed like in talking with folks who had been there the full conference for the entire time, that conference started with an opening keynote that may have been a little too positive for the folks who were there. And a lot of folks came up to us and said, the tone was off in the beginning. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to talk about some of the serious things that were happening and that they were facing. And I think as the conference went on, people got that vibe and settled into that and were able to address that. And hopefully our presentation helped them also do that. Mm-hmm. So what do you think resonated most with the audience members? Before we get into the Q&A, that's the last question I want to ask. What do you think resonated with the folks who were there? Of all the things we covered in that kind of rapid fire hour that we spent?
One of the things that I think surprised me was I did this sort of impromptu survey where I asked folks, who has, made their organization the hero of their story, and folks raised their hand. Yeah. Who has made their clients or the folks they serve the hero of their story, and folks raised their hand. And I think one of the things that surprised me was the number of people who are already sort of leaning this way, mm-hmm. And who are experimenting with models of like, how do we balance it so that, essentially everybody can be the hero of the story in a well-rounded way and not take anything away. And I think what resonated most was being able to put forward a model for holding that tension and keeping that balance.
Right. Sadé, from your perspective, what do you think resonated with the audience?
Yeah, I really like Josh's point. I think that was something that resonated for me, especially when folks were asking questions around how they show up in their organization, how they kind of navigate sort of the more difficult conversations. I think what hit me was that for many people, narrative strategy isn't really theoretical. It's actually like this daily tug of war between what you believe, what your organization is ready for, and what your donors expect. And that dissonance is real. So I kind of feel it in the room and that hunger for more conversation around it. I heard a lot of folks start to reconcile their positional power, not just like their institutional power, and maybe not being able to control top level messaging, but knowing how stories get shifted. So that sort of talking about that elephant in the room and kind of having that was what really seemed to resonate for the audience.
Excellent. Well, we had people reach out to us after the conference, immediately after. I had people come up to me after, and we all had people come up to us after. And so I want to share a couple of scenarios that came up that I want us to just kind of live workshop to begin with. And one of those scenarios, and I'm just going to keep it very general so that it might be applicable to many of our listeners who are listening. So one of those scenarios to begin with is a nonprofit professional that works for a large national nonprofit, and they control the messaging. But this individual works for kind of a regional office of that national nonprofit, and they feel like they don't have a lot of power to control or have any effect over the storytelling. And she's having a very difficult time translating that national brand messaging to a smaller, more relevant, more compelling message for her donors. What would you all suggest to that fundraiser and that person in order to feel like they could have some kind of impact on storytelling in their program? You know, they're the ones who do send out nonprofit fundraising appeals, and they create the content. Ultimately, it has to get approved through some kind of pipeline, but they are creating content and they can choose stories and things like that, but they just don't feel like they can really have an impact on that idea of kind of the organizational story.
I would say that there's sort of two practical guidance points that I'd have. One is because I'm an organizer, because I come from advocacy, I'm always thinking about narrative power and building. So one, I would say, yes, totally hear you that when you work at a chapter or a state office within a national organization, you can kind of get messaging after it's approved, packaged, sanitized, and then you're expected to just plug it in, which doesn't actually reflect the realities of your community. I would say there's a couple of things that you can do. You can first start with the idea, again, of power. So narrative power often starts with a collection, not just distribution. So even if you can't post something, you can archive it. You can build a sort of story garden that you draw on, and it surfaces in board meetings or grant reports or cross-chapter exchanges. So I think about narrative power as something that you're building within your own sort of local infrastructure. Then, so like that's the sort of power building practical tip of it. But then there's also this nuanced approach around what it could mean for you to begin to shift and orient around a horizontal sort of narrative coalition. So, for example, finding peers at other chapters who may be sharing your concerns and coordinating maybe smaller storytelling pilots and presenting feedback that is collective. When individual chapters tend to ask for change, it kind of sounds like complaints, but a coalition of chapters telling stories sounds more like a movement. So that's also a point around the power building piece of it.
Yeah. And I think in the clients that we've worked with who are in these situations, it's also important not to be seen by headquarters as kind of these insurgents, right? You want to be seen as team players. You want to make sure that, you know, you're at least keeping folks who need to know in the know. And you're doing it in a way that's seen as collaborative.
I would say yes. And you also have to do the job that you have to do on the ground while you're sort of doing the larger sort of piece of it. So I would say that, you know, narrative often isn't about like compressing the entire brand. It's just about finding one entry point that matters equally. So I would say start with the maybe like the one story that does connect for the larger narrative arc that makes sense to you locally. So, you know, if it's, for example, about food justice and someone saying something hyper broad about, you know, your national chapter saying something around equity-centered change, you know, and locally it's like, well, what does that mean? It starts with a story. It says like something about Maria told us she skipped lunch so her son could eat dinner, like something like that. And it's like, that's why our chapter is pushing for statewide SNAP reform, whatever it is that has that sort of narrative distillation that you need. So you break it into 3 S's, right? Like there's the story, the statement, and then the signal. So like the story shows the issue, the statement kind of summarizes it, and the signal is the thing that lets others echo or move it into the work. So I would say narrative distillation is my practical tip, But also, if a narrative from a larger organization doesn't really work for you, figure out what narrative power looks like to shift it.
Excellent. Before we get too far away from it, I love the term story garden.
Yeah, story garden.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, I totally dig that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that. Sadé, I love that.
All right, Josh.
So I actually, it's very funny that we're having this conversation now, because this week, working with a client, national, but focused primarily on state-based advocacy, and doing things to counter-narrativize some of the disinformation that's coming out around the One Big Beautiful Act, and also trying to message in their individual states to protect SNAP benefits, childcare benefits, Medicaid benefits.
Yeah.
And where we started, Russ, and this speaks directly to your scenario, where we started was all these national stats. Mm-hmm. But when we were having our internal meetings and then meeting with the client, we're like, well, these aren't going to be relevant to each of the individual states that are going to be joining.
Yeah.
So it can be the juiciest and most compelling and most telling and most illustrative statistic on a national basis.
Yeah.
But what does it mean in Arkansas or North Carolina or Wyoming?
Right.
And so we actually had to toss the entire presentation out, zoom all the way out, and say, what can we do to actually just focus on frameworks that can be applicable in any state? So taking this back to the hypothetical that you shared, or that, the audience member shared, I would say there are these kind of broad, maybe a little esoteric, sweeping national visions that the organization is putting forward.
Yeah.
And so there are ways to, Sadé's point, to tether individual actions that are happening on the ground, and maybe even individual specific engagements that are happening on the ground, to those loftier, broader ideas without getting bogged down in that.
Yeah.
And so that's where I would start with just thinking, what stories do we need to curate on the local level to advance the local issues that we're focused on?
Yes.
And then ground it back into some of this more national thinking. But I would reverse that orientation if I were in this individual's position.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
So I had an individual approach me and say, I'm in a food bank, and for years and years we've had traditional food bank messaging, but recently we underwent an entire brand overhaul where we've pivoted from this traditional food bank messaging in our metro area to a very social justice forward type of messaging. And what we've noticed that's happened is our older donor base has not really responded with the kind of engagement to this social justice forward messaging that we'd like. They were much more comfortable with that traditional food bank messaging. So they're obviously not going to abandon their new approach, but they would. This person would like some ideas on how to bring those older audiences along with this new brand positioning, not lose those older folks, but what should they do? What's your take on this, Sadé, if you'd go first?
Yeah. I mean, you're not just telling a new story, you're kind of asking people to change the role that they see themselves playing in it.
Yeah.
Actually, from a donor psychology point, that's the sort of big pivot.
Yeah.
When a food bank in particular pivots from like feed the hungry frame to dismantle a food injustice frame.
Yes.
It's not a communication shift, it's an identity shift that has communications around it. So you are a different institution and you're inviting a donor into that sort of new wave. I'd say it's not about maybe abandoning past donors. It's about inviting them in and using language to effectively do that. So I would use a message that says, you know, you helped feed thousands. Now together we're addressing why those families were hungry in the first place. That helps kind of create the continuity. It has bridge language in it. I would also like offer on-ramps, not ultimatums. So like basically you can't expect a donor who's been giving for 10 years, believing in a charity to jump like overnight into liberation. Like it's just not how donors work. You have to give them a ramp. So providing them with hybrid stories that still feature the personal individual impact, add a light touch of structural context. Like you have to kind of move them into this work. So it's not a dilution of messaging. It's like designing different invitations. That's why you have list segmentation. That's why you kind of work to create custom narratives that meet the donor's needs without jeopardizing your organization's strategy and mission. So building that sort of muscle of dual language or complex language and segmentation is what's going to be helpful. And then I would just also be honest. Like sometimes you are going to lose donors. You'll also gain some alignment in the process. I would not say to compromise the justice-centered language out of fear, but measure retention, not just in dollars, but like in values, deeper relationships, long-term trust. And the narratives can help you do that. But also the data tracking and segmentation is really important in that journey as well.
Excellent. Josh, what's your take on that?
Yeah, your listeners can't see me nodding enthusiastically through everything that Sadé says. So the first thing that I want to say, just zooming out, is it's really exciting to hear this conversation going that way toward adoption of social justice messaging at a time when I feel like so many feel forced to actually go the opposite way. DEI is under attack at a time when so many things are being stripped away and we're being forced to tailor messaging. You know, so I just want to call out the fact that, you know, we're having the conversation toward the right orientation, and that's exciting to me. And for the listeners, Sadé is now nodding enthusiastically at what I'm saying. So I feel vindicated, validated. The second thing is, I think it comes back to audiences. You know, you can have the same core value-centric messaging that you're putting forward, tailored differently to different audiences. So the first thought is that different audiences, without distorting or changing, you know, the overarching ask, different audiences can receive different messaging. And then I think, and one of the things that I heard Sadé say is that we can kind of phase in some of that new messaging with the old. So we start with maybe it's a soft launch of this new messaging with the social justice orientation in some of the older packaging. And then as that's being phased in, watch that messaging, watch what resonates, maybe even do some light lift A/B testing around things, and make a harder and harder case for it.
Absolutely. So what I didn't tell you is she's in a very, very competitive geographic area for this kind of messaging. And so what I suggested to her was, yes, a lot of A/B testing, because a lot of the organizations around her are sending out this exact same kind of messaging. And she is amongst a sea of very, very compelling nonprofit organizations doing compelling work that are saying basically the same thing. So what is really going to make you stand out? And the only way to know for sure is to test those messages and make sure you're logging that, and make sure you know that you're keeping track of what is actually going to work with variables, and only one variable per package. And If you can track that over time and see how you're moving your audiences, that will benefit you greatly.
Russ, can I just make a quick point for the listeners as well, that I think there is this concept of A/B testing as a tactic that is sort of informed by marketing, and we do a big push and we have our segment. I don't think it needs to be that heavy a lift.
Yeah.
With what we're talking about, I think there can be light touch A/B testing ways of just putting different things out on our socials where we have active engagement and watching what kind of engagement follows.
Yeah.
So I don't want a listener to come away from this saying, "Oh my God, I have to commission like an entire A/B test and a focus group and stuff." What we're talking about here is a pretty light touch, light lift method of A/B testing.
Right.
I mean, you can do that if you have the resources, but I don't think that all of that is necessary to see what messaging resonates.
Yeah. Something that happens a lot in quote unquote traditional fundraising is people just use their gut to make decisions. Mm-hmm. And it's not a good way to fundraise, right? You need to fundraise with some data behind you.
I would also say, I'm thinking about you naming that the messaging in the space is very competitive. Everyone's kind of pushing the same messaging. I would actually name, and this is helpful for everyone, not just food banks, that actually tone testing is something that we really have to talk a little bit more about.
Yeah.
I believe that organizations need to not just test what they say and start also testing how they say it.
Yeah.
So focusing on the voice, vulnerability, humor, surprise, like all of those sort of types of ways to present a narrative and test that as well, because that may also help you expand your base and shift and also stand out in a C. So maybe you have something that's like bold and unapologetic. Maybe you have a tone that's more intimate and vulnerable. You have something that's maybe more funny and self-aware. And I think that those are the types of things that we start testing that will help create the nuance of your organizational voice as well.
Yeah, it's super important because a lot of the vocabulary is the same, right? A lot of the lexicon of what people are using, it comes from the same book, and so that can be that can really be detrimental, I think, to the space. Great. So let's get into some more questions. So one of the questions we didn't really have time to get to on the panel is this one. What are some signals that a story is authentic? And what are some red flags that it's performative or exploitative? Josh, let's start with you.
So if it's a conversation that is happening in the world, in the cultural space, that you haven't previously been a part of, or isn't part of, I love the fact that I'm on a podcast where we're talking lexicon here. So if it hasn't been part of your organization's language and lexicon and messaging prior, and to be honest, we saw a lot of this post George Floyd, where people were just virtue signaling, but had never said anything prior to that massive earth-shaking event. That's a red flag.
Yeah.
Or if not a red flag, at least a pink or magenta one.
Yeah.
And it's something that is going to, people see through that.
Yeah.
They see through that immediately. Donors see through that.
Yeah.
You're not wooing anybody just by trying to woo them.
Right.
It actually goes back to the scenario that we were just kind of workshopping. Like, it's very interesting that you added the details about, that it's a sort of saturated messaging space around social justice messaging right now, because I would have concerns that is this organization suddenly pivoting towards social justice because everyone else is, or is that the values of the organization? And so wherever possible, and I know nothing about this hypothetical organization, so this isn't to cast aspersions on anybody, but how you actually signal is by making sure that things are value-centric and that they're the values that your organization consistently, maybe not as overtly as, in this positioning that we're talking about here, but consistently not just speaks to, but lives by.
Right.
And so that's how you build in that signaling that this is authentic, that this is real, and that these are the changes that we as an organization want to make.
Great. Sadé.
I love that. Thank you, Josh. I would say that an authentic story centers the narrator and not the narrator's pain. Something that offers dignity, agency, context, not just crisis. Whenever we start to see that, it starts to lean into a performative, exploitive sort of space. Usually the story framework is, if it's performative or saviorist, is like there is a savior, there's a villain, there's a victim, the organization is cast as a hero. Like that's a big red flag. I would always ask who benefits from the story being told, who gets to tell it. And if the person who reads the story, or if the person like kind of reads the story out loud to their own people, would they feel seen or would they feel stripped? And at the end of the day, authenticity isn't just about the facts. It's about like consent, context, and care. So if your organization has that, then you're at the founding blocks for an authentic story. I would say the storyteller, the organization not being the hero, if you're centering your work instead of the person's power, that is performative. I think that when you are wrapping things up too neatly, it's also performative. Like justice work isn't tidy. You can't just say you donate and now everything's fixed. Like that's not an honest sort of point.
Yeah.
And then I would also say that if someone's trauma is used as like clickbait, like if it's the photo or the headline or the first line that invokes pity instead of partnership, then it's exploitive. And that's a red flag. So I would start there. I don't know. I kind of really like what Josh is also naming around. If your organization doesn't walk the talk, then you should get out that conversation for a minute. Like that's kind of a great way to approach it.
Absolutely. All right. Another question. How have younger donors responded to changes in your storytelling approach? And we're not necessarily talking about super younger donors like 18 to 25-year-olds, but we're talking about those donors, maybe millennial age, that are supposedly replacing the boomer donors that we're all counting on to uphold philanthropy for the next generation.
Okay, talk about no pressure.
I know, right? Yeah. We're going to save the industry, Sadé.
I truly wish it was... I wish it was that easy.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. What we've seen is that this generation is definitely not responding again into like what the stories are told, but like how they're told. So this is why I say to organizations, you need to have multi-platform plans in order to engage across generations. Like you cannot tell the same story in the same way. Like it doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
They're able to access their information in multiple ways. So you have to be able to speak it with fluency. Things that I have done to update or refresh our strategy for millennial donors in particular is moving from passive impact to participatory power.
Yeah.
Millennials and generations a little bit younger than them really do appreciate moving from this is what we did with your donation to this is what the community led, this is how your support resource did. So this generation isn't just funding programs as previous generations have, it's funding power. So the idea of moving from sort of like millennial aligned storytelling isn't just about hardship, it's about the systems underneath. They're very much so interested in the systems. Also the aspirational branding to like transparent voice. They love a good like explainer video. Whoops, this happened in Congress. They love talent tones that are like grounded, not performative. They want to see the process. They want to know what's messy about the work. I would say boomer philanthropy is about assurance. Millennial philanthropy is about alignment. And those are two very different approaches to narrative.
Yeah, that's a great differentiation.
Yeah. I would start there. Yeah.
Excellent. Josh, can you build on that?
So first of all, I love Sadé's answer. I think that's totally on point. What I would add to it, first, this generation has a much higher BS meter. So they're going to see through things that may have worked even a few years ago that no longer work and are no longer effective messaging.
Yeah.
I like to, and I know this is a conversation that we've had before, Russ, but I refer to this as sort of like the Rick and Morty generation of storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So there is more story packed into a single episode of Rick and Morty than used to be on an entire series run of shows back in the day.
Yeah.
And what that means is that for us as social change nonprofit storytellers, we have to be far more effective in how we're curating those stories and delivering max impact. I love the point that Sadé made about paying attention to the tone. And so asking ourselves, what do we want our audience to feel when they hear this story?
Yeah.
What do we want them not to feel and to do after that? And then also having a built-in answer for how do I fit in? So making sure that the audience knows they're playing a part in this story. It is a meaningful part, and change cannot happen without their engagement.
It is such an important thing to engage younger donors. And I think that we even have some challenges to just bring along clients to say, hey, we do have to start moving in this direction. And clients are hesitant to do that. They say, we want to reinforce these very grounded talking points about the organization, about here's what your dollars do. And when you have limited real estate in an appeal, you have to make choices about what kind of messaging you want to use. And when you do the analysis of a donor base, a lot of the times it comes back where you have an older audience that you're messaging to. And so you have to find those kind of opportunities to start to move that messaging to that younger audience and say, okay, well, we can make this change. It'll still be good for the older audience, but it's also going to appeal to these younger audiences. And you start to make that transition over time. So we're almost out of time, but I just want to quickly answer one more question on my own. This question came to me from someone who was at the conference, and we didn't have time to answer it in the panel. And it's, how do you balance strategic storytelling with real-time communication needs like rapid response fundraising? So as with any rapid response approach, you want to plan for it ahead of time. Rapid response doesn't mean something happens and you react. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows there are events that are going to happen, and your organization is going to need to have some kind of response to them. By thinking ahead of time, you can figure out what storytelling is going to fit into that response. And again, going back to Sadé's comment about a story garden, you can cultivate your content so that you are ready to just plug in a piece from your story garden. Yeah. And there you go. That balances your strategic storytelling with real-time communication needs like rapid response. You might not have it all ready to go and everything's neat and polished, but there's a better chance that your rapid response fundraising is going to be aligned with your strategic storytelling approach.
Love that.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Sadé Dozan and Josh Gryniewicz, for all of your contributions, both at the Bridge Conference and in today's discussion. If listeners have additional questions, Sadé, where can they contact you?
Yeah, I would say send messages to my LinkedIn, actually. I love a good LinkedIn DM. So I am there, Sadé Dozan. I think I'm like one of two out there. So find me.
Excellent. And Josh, how do people get in touch with you?
Best way would be through oddduck.io. That's our site. Or they can just email josh@oddduck.
Excellent. And listeners, you know how to get a hold of me. Go to ipmadvancement.com, use our contact page. We called our presentation Flipping the Script because it's a different way of approaching storytelling than most of us are used to. It might seem confusing. You might get pushback from others inside your organization, but listen, you don't have to tackle it alone. So reach out to us. We'd be glad to help you and to answer any additional inquiries that you may have. Thank you to my guests. Thank you to our producer, Curtis Schmidt, and thank you to our listeners for listening to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. We'll see you next time.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.